Welcome to the Ludonarrative Podcast. My name is Preston Johnston.
And I'm Blake Guthrie.
And today we're going to cover Shadow of the Colossus.
Shadow of the Colossus came out in 2005 from Team Ico at the time, which later became Redesigned Studios based out of Japan and led by Fumito Ueda. And Fumito Ueda has been uniquely influential in bringing this Ludonarrative podcast to your ears. In an interview with a magazine, Fumito Ueda said, "I mean, it's as if everyone graduates from video games eventually. When I looked around at people of my generation, I noticed that they were all moving on, yet no one graduates from movies, nor do they stop listening to music as they get older. For some reason, though, they stop playing video games. Why was that? I wondered. I sensed a danger in it, that it boded poorly for the future." And that sentiment that Fumito Ueda articulated in that interview is exactly why we're motivated to have these long-form discussions about video games in this way. And Shadow of the Colossus kind of embodies the sort of video game, the sort of ludonarrative that you shouldn't be expected to grow out of. It's the kind of game that rewards a mature experience on behalf of the player.
It's also a game, I think, that demands some type of interpretive analysis. That you don't simply sit there and play out a plot or character action. You're also involved in a story-making process that you do not see in books, that you do not see in movies or in radio or television. You see it very much in game, where it's hefty visuals mapped onto character action, which then involves the process of pulling the avatar into the story-making device as well. That the character has already made these decisions, but then you start enacting what the character is going to do.
And a lot of what Shadow of the Colossus succeeds with in terms of its storytelling capacity is it is visual by nature. And so the game begins with a hawk soaring through the night sky, and there's kind of a panoramic shot that eventually zooms down in, almost as though riding on the back of another hawk, to zoom up on Wander. And Wander is riding Agro, this massive, almost war horse, and draped over Agro on the back is a young princess who is very bright, and she's wearing a white dress, and her name is Mono. And presumably Mono is dead, and we don't exactly have any more information than that, but the game's introduction follows Wander and Agro and Mono as they travel through this craggy mountainside and across waterfalls and desolate landscapes and through presumably freezing cold rains and through the forest, and eventually they emerge at a kind of, a geometrically complex architectural structure in which there's a narrow slit, a kind of trench where the characters can then go through, and on the other side we get a sense of the true vastness of what is known as the Forbidden Land of the game.
The architecture that Blake's describing, it does a very good job of implying a sense of lore about where Wander has just entered. The bridge, the extremely narrow bridge that leads to the thin slit for where you go into the temple, describes this inaccessibility, or this it's reserved for certain people or certain amounts of people. It does not want many people coming in, almost making it a sacred place. It's called a temple. It's demanding one person at a time makes their way across. And so that this entire area, this massive area, is contained inside of, when you're looking from the bridge, contained inside this very small entrance, is saying something about where Wander is going into, what Wander is getting ready to interact with, and what the player themselves is going to see and experience through both Wander and the player's own emotions. The construction that the bridge implies onto the area where the Colossi are contained is something that Fumito Ueda does very well in most of his games, creating this atmospheric, almost impressionistic way of developing a game and developing a story.
And one of the things that Shadow of the Colossus does uniquely well is it places the player in a sense of immense loneliness. The player, by shoving them through this narrow passageway at the very beginning of the game in terms of the atmosphere and the world building, where there's this bridge, and the bridge is kind of almost like a Roman aqueduct in its construction. It's this magnificent architectural creation that's probably 100 to 200 feet in the air above an otherwise barren desert. And you have the sense when you're crossing it, not only is it a one-way bridge, as Preston was articulating, but there's this kind of sense that you could fall off. And if you fall off, you're going into a no man's land where there's no sign of civilization other than the one beacon straight at the end of the bridge, which is this, well, colossal structure in front of you. And that it's the temple, or a lot of people describe it as the Shrine of Light or the Temple of Worship, or in any sense, it's the main hub for where the game will take place, because Wander first brings Mono to an altar inside of this temple, and he lays Mono down. And again, to the point about light and darkness in this game, Mono's white dress laid down with the light coming in from this oculus in the ceiling, this hole in the ceiling where this sunlight is casting down. It's almost angelic in a way. And that angelic, somber, innocent nature contrasts very distinctly with the music of the scene, with the shots, the angles that are framing Wander as he's approaching this altar. It's foreboding, and that tension between those two devices of narrative building and world building, they become exemplified in the first moment of, I don't know if you want to call it dialogue in the game, but Wander finally has an exchange with Dorman.
Dorman's introduction it feels mysterious. You don't know who Dorman is off the bat, other than having a name, or what Dorman relates to, other than Dorman has this ability to supposedly bring life back. However, bringing that life back almost you have to have something sacrificial, which is very much similar to making some type of pact with demons or with deities. And so you begin understanding that Dorman is this deity figure. Dorman is shown as this dual voice, or this even multiple voice, most likely dual voice between male and female, that's spoken at the same time. So there's this very interesting effect for not having a singular, almost not having a singular persona inside the voice itself. And so when Dorman speaks, there's the understanding that Dorman is, it implies this, Dorman is not saying exactly Dorman never tells Wander what's going to happen. Dorman just tells him to do actions. And so the player begins to mistrust Dorman, both the dual voice and the near commands that Dorman pushes on to Wander. Dorman also is shown through, whenever Dorman speaks in the temple, Dorman is shown through the oculus above, in the top of the temple, and the scene, the camera points up as Dorman speaks, and so the player then begins to associate this lightness with Dorman. However, again, that duality of who Dorman is, that Dorman is already not understood as being one thing. It's a multiplicity of different things. Is shaking this idea that Dorman has some type of goodness to him, because Dorman has demanded that Wander go out and murder or slay the Colossi.
The motivations for Wander being assigned this task to slay 16 Colossi is not altogether unclear, but the linking connection between Wander's actions and Dorman's motivations doesn't really surface until the game's conclusion. And one of the features of this game that serves to kind of shroud the narrative with more ambiguity is the fact that the language of the game, the actual dialogue that transpires in this introductory scene, is not in a discernible language. It's a kind of reversed Japanese hybrid. And there are a lot of theories about how to decode this language, but Dorman's voice, as Preston was describing, comes across as a multiplicity. And one of the interesting theories that I think has been advanced that I pretty much subscribe to is that there are, roughly speaking, 16 perceptible voices of Dorman there, because there are 16 shadow parts of the soul that you have to unleash throughout the Colossi. And throughout the game, there's a component of lore that the casual player might take for granted, at least at first, which is after Wander slays each Colossi, Wander is transported back to the temple. And
that's unknown. That's unknown how Wander gets back to the temple.
Definitely it's unknown, and what's an interesting design choice in this game is that the loading screen between the arena of the boss battle with the Colossus and the actual shrine of worship, the temple, instead of showing some kind of still image of a Colossus, a really epic shot, which would have been trending at the time, that's how a lot of game design was working, and it would show kind of a migrating button or like a rotating circle to indicate loading. It actually takes the player through a graphic of it's a wormhole of light mixed with kind of squiggles of darkness around it, and it's almost as though Wander's soul is being transported, or some kind of metaphysical vector is sucking him up, almost in a Star Trek kind of way, transporting him back with that dark energy that was just released.
I think it also mimics Dorman's place of speaking. The round circle when the camera pans up for Wander to listen to Dorman. It's circular, and so there's connections there, and then there's also the player as at the beginning of the game, not so much towards the end, because at this point a player paying attention is going to notice that there's something off with this relationship between Dorman and Wander. A player at the very beginning is going to say that, they are their focus is on creating good in this world, on slaying these Colossi. And so this beacon of light that Wander is being transported through, or is at least looking at, is then mimicked on the loading screen right after you kill a Colossus. And so there's a lot of not purposeful misinformation, but a purposeful visual graphic that is going to confuse the narrative a little bit, to add to the confusion that's happening in the story between Dorman and Wander, where that light makes an unsuspecting new player think that they're completing these positive tasks in this world, since Colossi, these big things, are roaming a vacant land that has rubble and destroyed human buildings in it.
One of the undersold components of Shadow of the Colossus, because a lot of people get distracted by the flashier elements of this game, which is to say maybe the music and the contrast between the ambience of the world roaming around and then the intensity of the actual boss battles, is that one doesn't actually need to battle the first or any of the colossi to read a kind of immensity into the scope of Shadow's story and Shadow's world. And we alluded to this with the brief discussion of the architecture and the bridge and the temple, but this is also because, and this is true of literature as well, that environments have an incredible capacity to shape a story and its interpretations. And one of the obvious examples that pretty much anyone would be familiar with is Lord of the Rings, with Middle Earth and with Mordor and Mount Doom and the map. One of the most rewarding parts of reading Lord of the Rings is turning to one of the first pages and seeing that map, the hand-drawn look to it. In environments, they do a lot for world building. And there's a really interesting article published by a scholar named Henry Jenkins, and he's argued in his essay called Game Design as Narrative Architecture about environmental storytelling. Environmental storytelling is what creates the preconditions for narrative immersion. And specifically, this happens in 4 ways, according to Jenkins. He says, spatial stories can evoke pre-existing narrative associations. And so that's true when you first enter the world and see the bridge and see the architecture. And there's this sense that people used to live here. It might be abandoned now, but this place used to be important. This is a sacred realm. The next point that he makes is that they can provide, or environments can provide, a staging ground where narrative events are enacted. And so a lot of the world building of Shadow of the Colossus, it's very bare, but it's kind of the stage for you, the player, to act out the role of Wander's character, the archetypal narrative that takes place throughout the story. The next thing he says is they may embed these environments narrative information within their mise en scène, which is a term for everything kind of in its place within the world. And so one of the things that Shadow excels with, and we'll get there, is lore. It's drenched in subtle pieces of lore. And the final thing he says is that environments provide resources for emergent narratives, which is a term that we'll be talking about in a future episode. But the idea for now is that there's more than the explicit story within Shadow of the Colossus.
When you were speaking, I heard the word "were," and you were saying there were humans here, that this is now a sacred place. And for me, when I heard the word "were," I thought that these colossi are doing a really good job of implying that something happened here. The surrounding area is again doing a really good job of implying something happened here. That visual lore that we keep speaking about is doing a really good job of trying to frame this area that Wander's in as a place where something happened, yet it's unknown, and it seems to be unknown to Wander unless Wander's acting out, which I don't think we have much evidence for it, acting out his own wants, regardless of what these wants might create in the world or manifest. And so I think looking at each of the colossi is a really good idea, since they provide almost contextual understanding for the realm that they're in. So what I mean by that is they're made up of what seems to be like rubble and old pieces of massive armor and buildings, all pushed together with this moss fur-like drapings growing on them. And so these colossi did not just come from nowhere. They came out of some type of horrible event. Their dominion over the land is a dominion over a land that has been destroyed and decimated. And so I think a lot of what Fumito Ueda is doing is providing us a way to look at the world in a way that we're not understanding that a specific event, which can be named, happened, but it's implying a much more broad or vague event of things that occurred to create these colossi.
I've spent kind of an embarrassing amount of time in the internet comments digging around through fan theories about the context that we're talking about that kind of isn't really there in the game. And there are some amazingly intricate theories about who Wander is, where Wander came from, where did he get his magical sword, which we should talk about. Why is this temple built there in this seemingly abandoned realm with all of these statues, and who is Dorman? All of these really interesting lore components. And one of the more convincing set piece theories that I studied through was, I believe on IGN, they have a very massive, 52-page sort of document compiling theories. And one of the ideas that was compelling to me is that Wander was an acolyte in a temple, and this temple is a kind of, let's call it, anti-Dorman religion in the way that Christianity is like an anti-pagan religion.
Right.
It juxtaposes itself in terms of false idols and that sort of thing. And so this forbidden land is abandoned precisely because various civilizations fled from it because it was cursed or because it was tainted or profane or evil or devilish and so on and so forth. And so Wander grows up in this temple, and we get a sense that because of his horse Aggro is huge. Aggro's a war horse by all accounts of size. Right. And so why is Aggro so loyal to Wander? How can Wander have such a good control? Well, I don't know about good control if you want to talk about game mechanics, but seemingly he doesn't have a harness, he doesn't have reins or anything like that. He just is able to whistle and Aggro comes running. And so there's an intimate relationship implied there, which seems like that reinforces the temple narrative once again. And not to get too ahead of ourselves, but there's a tribe involved that comes chasing after Wander towards the end of the game, realizing what he's doing. And the whole idea is when you enter that temple, I don't think, and correct me if you think I'm wrong here, Preston, I don't think Wander knows that Dorman's there. I don't think Wander knows what Dorman is. I don't know that Wander has any other information other than there is a spirit or a power in this land that has the power over life and death. And now we should move quickly into the question of Mono. Who is Mono? Is it a lover? Is it someone kind of like a virginal archetypal figure who was sacrificed to the other gods, and then Wander is the one who actually had to kill, hence his access to the sword, so on and so forth. There's all these really weird and intricate theories trying to piece together all the details that aren't literally there in the game.
My difficulty with one of those theories is that Wander asks he asks if the spirit, when you first get to the temple and it starts speaking to Wander, he asks if that spirit is Dorman, and Dorman says, "Yes, I am Dorman." My difficulty is that part. If Wander doesn't know who Dorman is, why does he already have a knowledge of who Dorman is? And if he is in a religion that's anti-Dorman, why is he asking after Dorman if he knows the religion well and knows what Dorman has done and will become afterwards? With Mono, I don't know if there's enough clues unless there's further fiction written about Shadow of the Colossus from Fumito Ueda.
Not from him, and any interview that you can find with Fumito Ueda discussing the game, he always frames it in terms of, this is my interpretation of the game. He never says what his intentions were for designing it. Right. And that's kind of a frustrating artistic choice, but it's also what continues to enshroud the game with so much of a cult following.
Well, I think he's struck onto something very powerful there. The power of narrative, and a narrative that remains both explored, because you quite literally explore the world on the back of Aggro, yet you also don't explore the world. The world remains as all the landscapes do in the distance. You might climb up mountains, but there are further mountains in the distance that remain unexplored, and so most of the narrative is that it's ripe for interpretation and ripe for reformation into how you want to view that world.
So I think we should turn into discussing the actual colossi themselves, because they're kind of the reason that this game stands out. And just speaking personally, I remember back in early high school, I was at a friend's house and everyone was kind of crowded around the TV in the living room playing Shadow of the Colossus, and they showed me this game for the first time. And I remember kind of smack talking it and dismissing it and saying, what's the point? It's so ambient. You're just running around on a horse through the woods, through this desert, through this corridor of pointlessness. And then, yeah, the music's good and that's one of the selling points, but I don't understand why people value this game so much and think of it as this, well, colossal achievement. And retrospectively, it took a long time for me to appreciate that, but I think one of the things that this game did really well for its time, and one of the things that still kind of holds up today in 2018, is that there is nothing in between the temple and the colossi. It's just the player on the horse going to seek out their locations. And some of the ways that you access these locations are puzzle-like. And from the very beginning, the game teaches you, there's a brief platforming element where Wanderer has to get off of aggro and climb up this cliff to approach the first Colossus. The first Colossus is Valus, who actually, all of these colossi have Latin names. This one is Minotaurus Colossus. And you don't need aggro to access this first one. It's just Wander climbing up the back of the leg and then up basically the fur coat of this, well, very anthropomorphic kind of creature.
So Valus looks like he's wearing a Nordic helmet. And I want to note before I describe Valus that each Colossus looks like they're wearing some type of mask. They have a face, yes, but that face looks like it's been pressed onto a furry face that's behind it. It doesn't look like it's... The face doesn't look like it's part of the Colossus's body. With Valus, it looks like a very large man, a very large warrior with a club, a Nordic warrior with a club, rocky, craggy, with this moss fur-like growth all over its back, all over its face, as if it has a very short beard on it. And then there's these two horns that almost crown the top of its furry head. The club looks like a column from a building, and that very much mirrors the disintegrated human structures that are around both Valus and some of the other colossi. Valus wanders out of a valley as Wander is approaching, and does not, just looks. Valus does not attack. Valus does not move towards the Wander or aggro. He simply continues meandering through the valley, and so it is Wander who initiates the combat. And the combat's pretty easy, pretty straightforward. Once you start taking down Valus, you get this sense that you're not... The scene does a very good job. The scene structures your emotions, structures something around your emotions, that you're slaying something that is very much alive. It makes noises, it cries out in pain. This black bile, almost like misted air, bursts forth from the wounds you're making on the top of its head. That you're striking deep into its head also has this kind of cringe factor going along with it, because you can hear the crunching of the sword into whatever the material the Colossus is. On top of that, the strikes that Wander makes onto the Colossus, onto Valus, are these... There's moments where you're grabbing on, trying to hold on as the Colossus and most of the other colossi are trying to shake you off. Yet, when you're able to get a good hold and the Colossus settles down, you pull back, and there's this momentary pause, as if there's this contemplative jab that he's going to make, and then the sword goes. There's moments, there's maybe a second, to 2 seconds of pause between the pullback and the strike of the sword. And I think that was an extremely helpful technique to push this feeling of you're slaying something. You're slaying something that's very much alive, that's moving underneath you, that doesn't want to die, that is in a sense trying to shake you off or fight you off. The atmosphere of killing these things really becomes pronounced when you're engaging with the Colossus. That becomes an atmosphere in and of itself that emerges out of the game in each of those little segments when you're attacking the Colossi, because those segments are the main features, the main battles for those games, as if you're only engaging bosses along the way.
That's definitely an explicit intention on behalf of the designers and developers of the game, and there's some really interesting bonus content on the PS3 deluxe bundle edition of Eco and Shadow of the Colossus. There's all these little studio cuts. You can find them on YouTube, but they kind of inform some of those design intentions of only wanting to design a game around bosses. And that's an astounding and unique thing, especially for its time. And there weren't those sort of, towards the Dark Souls continuum of sort of games where they're really oriented around being difficult. One of the things, while you were discussing slaying Valis, is really early on you become intimately aware of the ludonarrative components of the game, the controller, the R1 button that you have to hold down. As Wander, the character, you have to be cognizant of your grip meter, and your grip meter runs out fairly quickly in the beginning of the game. You can slowly increase that by a couple little lore things, and it's pretty clever lore. Like there's these little white-tailed lizards that you can slay, and when you slay them and collect their tails, your meters increase, and that's a pretty cool way to involve the player to pay attention to the world beyond the A to B.
Are these lizards specifically white?
There are a couple different kinds of lizards throughout the game's world, but the white-tailed ones are the ones that give you the bonus.
Why is it white?
Well, that goes back to one of the simple design elements of this game, which is that contrast of light and darkness.
Mm-hmm.
The lizard with the white tail is black otherwise, and that white tail, in the same way that when you're stabbing Valis in the first Colossus battle, there's those bright light symbols etched in on the place where you, or the player, are indicated to stab. And those places emit a black smoke that, or liquid, or I don't,
soot or something.
It's hard to describe what that is, but it's some kind of dark energy, and you know that it's not a good thing. It's bleeding for all intents and purposes.
Or releasing something like it's a container.
Sure. But what struck me while climbing Valis for the first time when I played this game was that grip meter, R1, it feels like you're gripping, like on your hand. And this is going to be kind of a continuous theme throughout this podcast, is talking about the actual controller itself. But when you're holding a controller, you're not holding it with your thumb, you're holding it with your fingers, the other four there. And the game designers could have designed that around circle, for instance. They could have made it more of an action button press. They could have made it just an auto grab. They didn't have to deliberately design a grip mechanic. But that adds all kinds of narrative tension into the climb, because at any moment you could be shaken off. And you know, as you stab the Colossi, they thrive in agony. They thrash in agony. And then another thing to your point about the sword is the timing involved. When you hold down the circle button to raise your sword, there's kind of a concentric circle, like a radar. It's blipping, showing you expanding towards the edges. And if you're patient, you gain power and damage that you can do to the Colossus as that ring expands towards the outside. And if you're impatient, or if you're a terrible video gamer like me, you might just get the stab where you can. But if you're more patient and tactful and let's say practical, then you're going to do more damage more quickly, and it rewards the strategic patient player.
After you slay Valis, first of all, the crumpling of Valis to the ground. This colossal being is done magnificently for when the game came out. Its attention to physics is astounding. Onto the lore that's happening on the screen as Valis is dying, or at least when he's decaying into this black matter. When Valis finally crumples to the ground and no longer moves, these black tendrils escape from him as if they were contained inside of Valis. And then Valis's Colossus skin either becomes and turns black as if it's rotting, or how I interpreted it was it melted away and revealed the blackness that Valis was containing inside. Because these colossi seem to be containers that hold the 16 elements of Dorman inside.
You know how I interpreted that kind of blackening of the skin there? I don't know if any of the listeners will find this valuable, but Princess Mononoke, the Miyazaki film, where certain creatures are corrupted and consumed by this dark, shadowy, maggoty energy that just eats their flesh and then leaves nothing behind. That's kind of what I was imagining, because we get the sense from the very beginning, as you said at the top of this conversation, the player gets a sense you shouldn't trust Dorman, and for you to go out and do Dorman's bidding, killing these colossi, you get a sense pretty quickly, especially when those, when the skin starts to change and the black is spewing out of the wounds that you're making. And then at the very end, when Wander goes to leave and run away, and these black, shadowy, almost lightning-like tendrils shoot out of the body and just pierce your chest, rendering you unconscious and seemingly dead, that
you realize you probably didn't do something that was good for you or good for the world.
Yeah.
I think one of the things I definitely read about was how emotional this game was. And I think the slaying of Valis is a good moment to just introduce that throughout the game, Wander doesn't really question what he's doing. Whereas the player who's simply enacting what Wander's doing, where Wander is already chosen, so the player's not choosing what Wander does, simply enacting it. The player is questioning it all the way through. And so that is going to create tension between the player and the avatar, Wander. And it's going to create tension between the action that Wander's taking and the action that the player is enacting Wander to take. And so there's going to be emotions that are coming out of this, because I'm sure everybody who has played this game has thought at the beginning, why am I doing this in the first place?
And even if they aren't thinking why, they're probably justifying that and not asking that question because they're thinking how, and they're thinking in terms of A to B plot task oriented reward sort of systems. Most video games, especially for 2005 when this game was released, were buying into this optimistic, happy ending sort of narrative. I think Shadow of the Colossus is unique, and that common reaction of it being emotional comes about because of how, tragic the ending is. And you get a sense early on that the ends are going to justify the means, and if not about halfway through the game, it becomes pretty clear through some various attentions to detail that that's not really the case. And I mean, one of the obvious things, if not the black stuff shooting out and all the tendrils and stuff when you kill the Colossus, the slow... You were talking about the physics of the death and how the Colossus comes lumbering down, and the first Colossus is 70 feet tall. That's 21 meters, and to watch that come down is no insignificant feat.
Right.
You would imagine it would leave this massive dust cloud, and then there's this melancholy, heartbreaking music of kind of opera almost going on in the background as well that ties in, and then all of a sudden you wake back up at the temple. And so I don't know that listeners will find it terribly valuable to go through all 16 colossi, but maybe we should touch on a little bit of each one.
Touch on the interesting ones, yeah.
So the second one is Quadratus. kind of horse-looking. Well, not a horse. I don't know what you say. Maybe. Well, it's a, as the name suggests, a 4-legged colossus that has hoofs, and like you were describing with the mask sort of thing, it's got a very. I'm bad at describing things, but it's got a mask.
This one was gorgeous. I really appreciated the presence of this one. It's bull-like. So it wanders out of a cave. You're directed by Dorman to go to where light cannot reach, or something along those lines. I don't remember the exact words. But when you get there, you wander.
I've got it if you want it.
Yeah, please.
It says, "Thy next foe is in the seaside cave. It moves slowly. Raise thy courage to defeat it."
Thank you, Dorman. And so you have Wander, who goes down to a cave and entices this creature to emerge. Quadratus is the thing that emerges, and Quadratus looks like buttresses from a cathedral have been fastened to its back, making up ribs and spine that runs the length of its body, and then its legs are these festooned like pillars that have knees in the middle, and then its head is it almost looks like the front of a steam engine has been grafted onto its face. Again, this mask-like structure with 2 bull horns sticking out of the side where one horn is broken off. Quadratus looks like a moving battering ram, something that is going to unendingly move forward regardless of what's in front of it. It also has on Quadratus, on its belly, this very harsh thick stone skin, and so it forces you to climb onto the back of Quadratus where the weak points are.
When I was first playing Quadratus, one of the things that took me off guard is one of the weak parts, because the first Colossus, it's pretty obvious points. You stab on the back of the leg, and then you climb up and stab it on the head, and so forth. But with Quadratus, this second Colossus, one of the weak spots is under the hoof, or under each hoof. And you have to be well-timed with your bow and arrow, which is not something that you necessarily had to rely upon in that first battle. So that is just a stunning, that's just a stunning gradation of game difficulty and mechanics, and kind of letting the player get their feet wet and get accustomed to the temperature of the water, so to speak. And then an interesting side note, just a detail about this second Colossus, it's 98 feet, which is, almost 8 meters taller than the previous one. And it feels that way, too. This takes place in an arena.
The other thing, Quadratus, so with Valus, you can see humanness in Valus's form. Again, Valus looked like a Nordic warrior with a big brown cape and a Nordic helmet on. With Quadratus looks like an animal. It looks like something coming out of nature. However, when you're as Wanderer and as the player, when you're peering at Quadratus's eyes and face, there is a sentience that's happening inside of its face. You're not slaying something that is destructive, that is immediately understood as dangerous. You're slaying this lumbering sentient creature that honestly does not care for your present. It has no preference for your presence. It simply wanders out of a cave, and that you're the one again who strikes first and brings it down by the bottom of the hoof. So when you're bringing it down, Wander's making an action where he's choosing to ignore the sentience in Quadratus's face. So I think there's a lot contained in the first 2 Colossi that speak to the last 14. On top of that, I think that Fumito Ueda does a really good job for bringing together how to play the game. Like, he leaves it up to the player to decide, but he leads the player with 2 fairly easy colossi, and also shows the player that it's going to be tricky to slay these things. And that's determined by Quadratus. Quadratus is not immediately present. It's only immediately present if you're on the ground paying attention. And so that's a very interesting way to teach someone by nearly forcing the player to fail until they learn.
There's kind of an aspect of storytelling that might get underappreciated when you're playing Shadow of the Colossus as well, which is that this game could have been framed in a morally neutral or positive way. I mean, it's a pretty dark and negative and culpable situation by the end of the game. It's kind of a reaping your own rewards. But imagine if Shadow of the Colossus played the exact same way, but instead these colossi were breaking out of this forbidden land and raiding the village and attacking the people, and then Wander had to, scale them up and fight them in the same way, but for a very obvious and clear moral good, that sort of purpose. This game could have been framed that way, and you wouldn't have to change the way it plays whatsoever. But it's a very deliberate thing, and I think that this second Colossus being animal-like, showing that kind of... Well, it has the same eyes as the first Colossus. It's that kind of window to the soul, so to speak. And that builds empathy very early on. If you weren't sympathetic to the human-formed one, I think most players, and we'll get to this with Aggro later, the horse, will be more hesitant to slay what looks like an innocent animal.
Yeah, very true. That's what the Colossi... To comment further on the Colossi, and also Quadratus specifically, the Colossi seem to have exoskeletons of past civilizations on them, almost like their bodies are made up of human-built mistakes or human-built cities that failed or did not succeed. And again, this is that visual context, visual lore popping out and making sense of the world for the player. And Wander is unaware of all of that. He simply climbs over it. Wander's task is mono, and mono is 1. And so Wander wanders onto the field and simply slays these colossi without thinking and without perceiving the things that he's climbing over other than the spot that he's trying to get to.
So after defeating Quadratus, Wander moves to the third Colossus, which is... Oh, God. What did I just do? There, okay. Which is Gaius, who is also known by the developers as the Knight character, and he is a staggering 79 feet tall as, just a beautiful moment of proportion. When you scale up, you approach on Aggro's horseback. Wander gets off and has to enter this lake, and this is this big, empty, dead-looking lake where clearly nothing is living in it. And there's a kind of, a spiral platform ramping up towards this ledge where you have to grab and jump across to get onto what is kind of an island in the middle of this lake, about 100 feet up. And when you get up there, you're wondering, well, where the heck is this Colossus? You see a bunch of rocks, you see kind of a grassy hillside, you see a platform or two, and you move and realize pretty quickly that the rocks that you just took for granted in the landscape are actually the Colossus laying in a little heap. So the rocks that are maybe 7 feet tall become this 79-foot tall Colossus pretty quickly, and Gaius unlike the first two, is ready to attack you.
Yeah, Gaius does react. So with Gaius, Gaius is festooned in what looks like clockwork or gearwork armor, and it clads the Gaius's entire body. Gaius is furry. Its moss-like fur coats the Gaius's entire body. Gaius has a chest plate and shoulder guards and what looks like, again, some type of Viking or horned helmet. Yet the Gaius's full appearance looks very kingly. It's extremely tall, it's thin, it's almost wizardly or kingly looking in its full height. And along with all of this geared armor or clockwork armor comes along this massive club-like sword that Gaius throws down at you and tries to crush Wander with. With Gaius, we have an introduction into these glyph-like writing on both Gaius's wrists and upper thighs. The glyphs are simply lined. They look like, I don't even know what they look like. What do they look like? They look like lines that run into each other, yet they look like they could be miming some type of design or intelligent writing.
It kind of evokes the ancient Greek pattern of, I don't know what the form is called off the top of my head, but it's very geometrical and it folds in on itself in a reliable kind of performative pattern sort of way. I think one of the cool things about Gaius is that he swings his sword at you first, and the unsuspecting player might get hit by this sword coming down on you.
The most immediately apparent thing on Gaius, he doesn't have a mask. There are just two eyes set into a furry face, and there's an implied nose and an implied mouth. Both the nose and mouth are simply blocks in this fur. And then the eyes mirror that oculus that Dorman speaks out of. This light emanating out of the darkness in the temple. That's what Gaius's eyes emulate. With the glyphs are the same colors as the eyes. And so you get this connection back with the temple that Gaius is similar to that light, containing or holding on to that light that Dorman is supposedly speaking out of.
So unlike the first two Colossi, Wander has to scale up the sword of Gaius. Gaius is swinging his sword trying to attack you and take you off guard, and the best, easiest way is to get, or rather trick Gaius into swinging his sword down on these platforms, which end up shattering parts of his armor, and just from the sheer force of impact that he's swinging this massive pillar down at you. And when his armor shatters, that opens up a new pathway for you to climb up his arm from. And it's ridiculously epic to run up the sword of a 79-foot tall Colossus to then, grapple and hold on for dear life on his fur as you strategically move around the back and end up taking out its weak points on its belly and on its head and so forth. Gaius, for me at least, is kind of the most iconic of Colossi in this game. I look at Gaius and think of films like The Iron Giant growing up, that cartoon. And I just a massive, terrifying, human-like force extant in the world. And I don't have much more to say about that one, but it was intimidating to go up against him.
Yeah, I would say. I think it's also impressive how after he swings the sword down and it lands in the earth, making this immense crater, Wander climbs up onto it, and as Wander climbs up to it, Gaius, with these almost seemingly intelligent, knowing eyes, watches you run up the sword. He peers at you, and that was something I saw, and I thought that's very interesting that they have these colossi, because the first two did that as well. Mm-hmm. The first two, they peer at you. Gaius is you're very aware he's looking at you, though, because you're running across extremely open ground, and so Gaius has this option just to slap his hand on the sword and murder you. And yet he doesn't. He just continues watching. Yeah. And so there's this placidness that Gaius is like, there's this murderousness that Gaius is throwing down on the ground, and yet as soon as you're on top of him, he becomes calm, besides trying to shake you off.
And there's almost kind of I don't have a more articulate way of putting this. There's almost kind of a dumbness in his eyes when you climb up on top of his head. It's just kind of staring out into space with these little beady, dinky, glowing eyes.
Right.
They're not, frantically looking up to see Wander doing the damage. They're not, strategically recalibrating how to use the landscape in its own favor. It's just one of those things where it looks so intimidating until you're scaled up as high as the Colossus is. Right. And it's almost like you're on top of a child.
Yeah. A child trying to crush ants. Phaedra, when Phaedra is introduced, you find Phaedra in this cauldron of a mountain, and you lure Phaedra out of this alcove cauldron, and so Phaedra is again back on all fours. So we've gone from human looking to bull looking to human looking back to this quadruped, and so Phaedra is pronouncedly different than Quadratus, where Phaedra is on longer legs with delicate points at the end of each leg, and these legs almost look like seashells, these sharp seashells stacked on top of each other until you get to the shoulders, where you get this robust body with these slender stone ribs that slide down the sides into an empty chest. There's nothing there. And so there's coming out of this hairy body that has these ribs sliding down the sides is this long neck with again we're back to having a defined mask almost pressed into the furry face of Phaedra. And with this mask come these massive tassels. They almost look like tusks, but they swing to and fro as Phaedra moves, and so there's this beauty to Phaedra's movement, especially when you crawl down into these little holes to make Phaedra bend, because you can't scale the sharp seashell legs to get onto Phaedra, so you have to force Phaedra to bend down. And so when they do, these tassels drop on the ground and they shiver and flow back and forth, and so you grab onto them and scale them up. But all of that movement of each colossi it's fine-tuned and it looks gorgeous. There's not a moment where the colossi move agonizingly, besides when you're stabbing.
It's interesting that you've spent time talking about how beautiful this Colossus is, because I remember distinctly when I was playing for the first time being a little bit creeped out by this one. Something about the misty alcove where you have to go find it, the foresty region, the hills, the tunnels. It just creeped me out more. And though the developers describe Phaedra as the giraffe Colossus, it's really kind of a praying mantis-looking horse. It looks a little insectoid. It's got the exoskeleton that we've been talking about, but it's also those tassels that you're describing. They're almost like reins for a horse. And it's just this weird, unusual, and the precise term might be uncanny experience encountering Phaedra. I felt for the first time a little bit, well, more intimidated in that battle than I did in the first.
Avion is the next Colossus, and as its name, it is definitely a bird. Avion has a dragon-like tail that flows behind it. It has an extremely long body with immense wings. Avion's face is again back to the mask. It's very ornate looking, very well detailed. We're back to the ornate design, almost sculpted appearance with again these sentient eyes peering out. Avion also has moss growing on its wings, the top of its wings, almost like grass pads, and along its back all the way to the end of the tail has this moss growing on it, or this fur. And so the bird Avion is just it's a very beautiful creature. It has a crest almost like a pileated woodpecker, and its tail is just as ornate as the beak and the face of Avion. The tail is where I through the playthrough I watched, where the person accessed it, and how they did that was they would draw fire at Avion and then draw Avion towards it and then grab onto Avion's tail as Avion tried to dive bomb the player. And so you run along the back, and Avion does spirals and loops and all of these intricate patterns to try and knock you off. And just to comment on the programming that would require was, I don't know. I honestly don't know how they did that for that time.
Yeah.
Everything that I've seen in this game with the Colossi, besides Wander, because Wander has these blips and problems sometimes, but the Colossi have always been smooth.
One of the astounding things about this game is how large of a scale everything is rendered in. Like the amount of processing that they had to put on the PS2 at the time, which ran compared to the PS4 43 times slower.
Right.
Like it was just that much more primitive. And to think that not only was it rendering this environment in which this battle is taking place, which is ridiculously large for any video game,
right,
but on top of that, there's this moving terrain that the character has to navigate and then complete objectives on.
Right, and so, yeah.
And that's true of all of them, but this Colossus, this fifth Colossus, is the first moment where it's entirely disorienting. You're in the air, about to be flung off over just, hundreds and hundreds of feet. Instant death in a way that the first four battles, they had that potential there, but this kind of just transforms it in a different way.
Right, so to put this into perspective, programming characters into elevators in video games is difficult because the elevator at first is part of the main scene that you're in. And so when the character enters the elevator, you have to use a new element. The elevator is now moving and becoming separate than the floor. And so as the elevator goes up, the character needs to move along with the elevator and not dimple into the floor. And so that requires a tremendous amount of time and consideration in how you're going to make sure these two elements remain pushed away from each other enough that you don't see the avatar's player, the avatar, get pushed into the floor. So with that perspective, having Avion and having Wander run on the back of Avion while it's rendering the stationary world around Avion was marvelous to see.
Absolutely. I don't want to completely exhaust all of the Colossi in this game from start to finish. There's 16 of them, and we've talked about 5 already, but it'd be worth mentioning some of the more bizarre or unique or astounding or even confounding experiences with the rest of them. And for me, one of the more intimidating of the colossi was the ninth one, Basaran, Basarin. And this one is known as the turtle. It's pretty enormous, but the way that it moves, I wouldn't be so quick to call it a turtle. It feels a little bit more like a crab. And I'm a bit of an arachnophobe. Anything with more legs than me kind of starts to freak me out. And this one, the way that it moves in the spiked shell on the back, hence the kind of turtle association, and then the rim-jawed face that this creature has, all of this just intimidates me in a way that it's not relatable. It's not human-looking in the way that some of the other colossi have been, and it's not really animal-looking in the way that the rest of them have been. This Colossus feels like something out of the underworld.
It looks remarkably alien, and it has no... With all the other colossi, all the other ones, I can place them in their elements. I can place them in their where you find them, Avion in the sky and all the others. But this one is an amalgamation. It's almost like someone bound a whole bunch of different creatures into the same shape and hoped it worked.
The next one that I think would be worth talking about is actually the 10th one, right after Basaron. It's called Dirge. And Dirge, the 10th Colossus, is 260 feet long, which is absurd. This one is known as the Dragon by some of the developers. And if you look up images of this, especially if you haven't played this game, some of the images that come up, at least on Google results, are terrifying. This Dirge Colossus has... It emerges out of the sand, out of the desert, and Wander has to ride on horseback, on aggro, with his bow and arrow, and hunt down this Colossus, who is actively trying to throw you off of the horse, and is doing a really good job by virtue of its size, and its just burning, creepy eyes.
Almost like crimson. Like there's an extreme difference between this creature's eyes and the other creature's eyes. Did you also notice that whenever you killed the colossi, their eyes would disappear? The light would actually go out of them?
Yeah, definitely.
Like you were silencing, Wander himself was silencing the light that was containing the darkness.
Definitely. And there's, going back to that lore, the kind of metaphysical relationship between light and darkness, the kind of shadows that come out when you kill a Colossus, as opposed to the light beaconing energy that comes out of their little symbols that you have to stab, and the eyes.
Yeah, those symbols are they're light seals, and so as the player, I would think that the player would have a reaction to, I'm stabbing a light seal, and Dorman is supposedly light, and when I'm stabbing it, it's releasing black soot or black bile or something, and so isn't this wrong?
Yeah,
like there's a lot of implications in those actions.
Mm-hmm. I think we can take for granted the rest of the Colossi, as cool as some of the rest of them are, including Cenobia, who there's a lot to think about, and Phalanx, which is fun and hard and adrenaline spewing, Celosia, which is one of the first Colossi that's actually pretty small, that evokes a kind of empathy, or actually more accurately a pity in you, the player. But these sort of things might be better experienced by playing them. One thing that I did want to spend some time talking about in this discussion is about the morality of Shadow of the Colossus. And Dan Olson from Folding Ideas on YouTube has an amazing video on this subject. Shadow of the Colossus' moral narrative emerges through ambiguity and dissonance within the game. The story presents a protagonist, Wander, who embodies William Faulkner's suggestion that the only thing worth writing about, telling stories about, is the human heart in conflict with itself. The dissonance within Shadow arises from Wander's internal contradictions.
Okay. So
Dan Olson's video, The Morality of Shadow of the Colossus, he talks about how the game presents the player's interest to be instinctually aligned with Wander's. We think that we're buying into a protagonist at the beginning of the game, and the player is emotionally predisposed to sympathize with the person that they're manipulating on the controller. And so this game really subverts that tendency in a really clever way. It's really easy to identify with the character that you're manipulating, but this game resists that and actually adds a kind of narrative, or rather ludonarrative tension there. It's not dissonance. It's not something that doesn't work.
No.
It's just something that challenges your assumptions going into the game.
Yeah, I don't know if I can... Yeah, a dissonance doesn't work. And I think where the first part that challenges your assumption, or the first part that makes you assume something about the story, is where Wander goes to the temple. There's this long journey across the bridge. You get to the temple, you go to the sacred ground, implied by the very small entranceway in the long bridge, into the temple, and then you go to the temple, then you go to the altar, which is just lighted. And so there's this hopefulness or holiness going on around. And then the cover that's covering Mono gets swept away by the wind, and then you're speaking to this deity, and you're looking up the camera as almost like your Wanderer is looking up at this light. And so there's a lot of purposeful story creation going on there by Fumito Ueda to create these assumptions in the player. And so then everything that happens after that scene is a very slow, almost methodical, and ambiguous breakdown of those assumptions. And it doesn't do it cleanly. It does it with a way that these things are, where the Colossi are built from what looks like old human civilization rubble. And then there's this, as you said, this dumbness about the eyes of the Colossi, but there's also this sentience. And then there's this juxtaposition of breaking lighted seals with releasing blackness. And so you have this constant contextual lore, this contextual story taking shape outside the temple that you then bring back in without understanding how Wanderer gets back into the temple. Yeah, there's a lot of purposeful misdirection and misnarration going on, and I think it's really interesting to see how you can do that, all of that, simply by how you have a character interact with the outside world and how you have a character act out a series of choices.
In literature, a lot of times we discuss unreliable narrators in the books where we're led down a certain ideological path and we think we can make certain value judgments about what's going to happen in the plot, when in reality we're seeing through a rather narrow prism. And in a sense, this isn't exactly what that literature discussion of the unreliable narrator is doing. This is almost like an unreliable player. It's almost like what the player is coming into the game with isn't to be trusted.
Right. Ooh, that's a very nice mirror back. Yeah, that's a very nice mirror. Because you're the one who's creating the assumptions. Because you're never told anything. You're just assuming stuff.
Yeah, Wander isn't sitting there having an inner monologue throughout the game. The only real interaction you have other than the beginning and the end is Dorman's instructions of where to go next.
To support what you're saying, with Final Fantasy X, you have the main character who acts as a narrator explain the story to you. Whereas in Shadow of the Colossus, there is no explanation. Like with Final Fantasy X, you can understand why you've been duped because you have purposely been duped by the narrator. Shadow of the Colossus, there is no duping. No one is trying to pull the wool over your eyes. It's simply you've assumed this about who Wander is, and you're going to break it down, tear down those assumptions, since you're watching all of these actions happen.
The morally uncertain shift between fear and empathy in Shadow of the Colossus manifests itself in this kind of cyclical progression as Wander kills each successive Colossus, and with each death, Wander's unconscious body is teleported, like we've talked about, back to the temple of the game's beginning. It's the same temple where Mono's body has been laying still well, presumably dead this whole time. And before Wander awakes, one thing that we haven't really spent time on is the corresponding Colossus statues. There's these idols throughout all 16 in the temple, and they explode in a burst of light energy when Wander's teleported back. And it's as though the dark energy released from the Colossus's death is also released in the form of light energy as the statue explodes. It's this kind of moral polarity, confused between the simultaneous emission of light and dark energy. And this, at least as far as I'm concerned, underscores the kind of invitation that this game gives to its player to interpret the game rather than telling the player how the story should be told. And just to complicate this a little further, each death of the Colossi, it harkens this kind of, well, this apparition of an additional human-like shadow figure that corresponds in number directly to the number of killed Colossi. And so as you kill the first, there's one shadow creature. As you kill the second, there's two standing over your unconscious body, all the way to 16 at the end. And this is morally affective because, as people like Dan Olson have noted, the anthropomorphization of the Colossi, this injection of human qualities to evoke empathy in us, it's played out in reverse on Wander's character. At the beginning of Shadow of the Colossus, Wander has a pale and smooth complexion to his skin, but by Shadow of the Colossus's end, Wander looks sick, scarred, unhealthy, bedraggled, like an alcoholic with too much, overload on his liver. And this transition reaches its limit when Emon, the kind of tribe elder at the end of the game, tries to seal Dorman away once more. And it becomes clear that if the player is paying attention from the very beginning of the game, watching these shadow figures appear around their unconscious body after each Colossus, that Wander is degrading physically as this darkness is entering him. And just a footnote to all of this, I didn't realize this when I played it myself, but watching other videos in preparation for this discussion, if you watch Mono's body, because Wander, when he first wakes up, he gets up and walks over to check on Mono's body each time, there's a white dove that will appear in correspondence with each one of these shadow figures. So that light and dark polarity, that kind of holy and sacrilegious vibe, that the sacred and the profane elements within the temple that are implied there, they're never told to us, but they show up. And it complicates it, and what I think is really valuable here is Dorman isn't just evil.
Right.
Things go wrong for Wander. Things fall apart for Wander. There's a kind of amorality in slaying and murdering Colossi that are otherwise innocent, not harming anything. But I don't think that you can clearly say that Dorman's motivations are altogether malicious.
No, I don't think we can say Dorman's motivations are even understood. Other than wanting to be released, but again, that's implied in the slaying. That's not something that's directly said. That's something that's indirectly said by go do this, and then there's a release. I think the other thing with the statues connected to the slaying of the Colossi, with the Colossi, when they're slayed, there's a collecting of blackness. The blackness or the darkness is collected. The shadows are collected. Whereas with the statues, when they break, the light is released and it's not collected. It simply dissipates. And so it goes back to the breaking of the seal. The seal goes away. The darkness is released and then collected. The statue breaks, and that same light dissipates and disappears, and then Dorman speaks again for the next Colossus, to slay the next Colossus. So I think there's many different ways to interpret this, and I think that's one of the beneficial parts of this game, is that it is a playground ripe for interpretation, since there is not a hefty explanatory system going on as you're playing the game. It leaves the actions to be, why did you do this? How did you do this? What were the implications? And so a lot of those questions are going to pop up, and they're going to go back to that. The game can be interpreted in many different forms. I
definitely agree with you, and I think in addition to what you're saying, there's and also to go off of what I was saying about the kind of cyclical nature of the moral structure of this game, there's also this implied narrative in Shadow of the Colossus that directly corresponds to the moral status of the other characters too. It's not just Wander's act of killing the otherwise innocent Colossi, although that does result in his kind of physical, spiritual, and moral degradation and degeneration as a character. But I think as each Colossus falls, that dark energy, as it transfers from Dorman to the inside of their bodies to Wander's own, Wander's repetition of this, it's like a spiritually violating act that reliably coerces him towards this inevitable and violent end, that battle with the 16th Colossus. And I know we said we were going to gloss over the rest of those, but I think that's kind of... I think anyone who talks about Shadow of the Colossus needs to spend a moment talking about Malice. And it's not Malice as in English, it's Malus. With Malice's presence as a Colossus, he is stationary, which is unique. But he is attacking you with a vengeance. I mean, he is shooting ballistic missiles that blow rubble out of this kind of maze tunnel infrastructure that you have to cleverly hide your way through as you sneak up to climb and kill Malice.
Right.
With Malice's defeat, and maybe we should talk about what he looks like and how the battle is and that sort of thing, but I think that's the moment when obviously all 16 parts of Dorman's soul are able to kind of coalesce once more into a unified demon or daemon that emerges from Wander's wounded and then corrupt body at the end of the game. And this logic of consequential violence, it starkly contrasts itself to characters like Mono, who are shown in the light as innocent, as ethereal characters who lay inanimate throughout the main story. And Mono arriving innocently into the Forbidden Lands, she presumably isn't consenting to her own resurrection. She takes no part in the killing of the Colossi, but she's implicated in each Colossi's death. Wander is surrounded with these additional shadow figures, while Mono, on the other hand, is surrounded by these white doves, and these doves... they bring to mind this biblical kind of dove. This sort of appearing after God's flooding of the earth and symbolizing peace. And that doesn't, once again, we were talking about how this game immediately subverts your expectations. It seems like upon defeating the 16th Colossus, peace would be brought about, but that's not really the case. There's one more violent bout in the game before its final act.
When you're talking about this lightness that's surrounding Mono, I think another way to look at it is the Colossi have light in their eyes, and when the light goes, they're filled with darkness. Mono is dead, so when the Colossi die, they become dark. Mono is already dead, meaning she most likely has darkness or does have darkness inside of her. And so all through the game, you're watching Wander kill Colossi, stripping the darkness out of them and taking the darkness into himself, and then being ringed by these human dark figures around him, while on the opposite side where Mono is, where she's rimmed in light, she already has darkness inside of him. So it's like he's attempting to pull the darkness of death out of Mono, replacing it with light, and then the doves start encircling Mono, and the black figures begin encircling Wander. And so there's this immediate difference, opposition inside the temple between the two.
Yeah, and I think another way that I've tried to conceptualize what the doves are doing there, I think they're kind of silently protesting Wander's action.
Yeah.
They're gathering, they're making a public assembly in this temple around her body, almost protecting. And I just think that's a really interesting way to think about it. And we didn't really just get to the Malice thing, but there's a moment before Malice, that final battle, the 16th Colossus, with another kind of climax of this story, which is Agro's death.
Right.
So
throwing Wander, Agro throws Wander off to get him across the bridge.
Yeah, so right at the end of the game, there's kind of a broken bridge that Wander's riding his horse Aggro, and he has to jump onto this bridge that then falls apart once they land. And so Aggro, being a great horse, runs and then bucks him off across onto the ledge to safety. And then Wander turns around and watches his horse fall hundreds of feet down into this river, washing away, just clearly dead. And so Wander's character, at least as animated in the game, calls out to aggro, but doesn't display any visual anguish, any kind of response. Wander is so hardened by his journey at this point that it's a loss, but it's the kind of loss that is insignificant because it doesn't get in the way of his ultimate quest, his single-minded mono quest.
Right, and I think just by saying just by asking the question, what is Wander's focus? His focus is mono. Just saying that sentence, saying the answer, shows you already. It demonstrates that Wander only has one focus and is only able to have one focus. That's a really interesting. That Fumito Ueda, that can come out of that story of Shadow of Colossus, that you can ask that question, and mono already demonstrates that as Wander's focus. That to me feels, I don't know, it maybe not purposeful, at least it's, I don't know what it makes me feel.
Well, unlike a lot of commercially successful games, especially for 2005, Shadow of the Colossus is featuring a relationship, like a one-on-one companion relationship with Wander and aggro. And aggro isn't interchangeable, isn't killable, or isn't abandonable. It's integral, almost like his Wander's sword or Wander's bow, just something necessary to the story's completion. And given that aggro is Wander's sole companion who follows and rides Wander into his battles with these colossi, there's this deep-seated connection between humans and animals that this game acknowledges. It might not say it, but at least it acts it out.
This game doesn't say much,
no,
other than implying a whole bunch.
But aggro, it builds an organic connection with Wander and the player as she reliably displays loyalty, courage, and selflessness in this final act of saving Wander. Wander's connection with aggro is powerful precisely because of how fundamentally, inherently lonely of a game, of a narrative journey, Shadow of the Colossus is. Aggro is Wander and the player's only company, which renders the bond forged between these two characters just unbreakable. The relationship between aggro and Wander feels uniquely real as opposed to other artificially intelligent characters from video games, and part of that is due to Wander's lack of ability to precisely control aggro's movements. When you're riding horseback, and we didn't really talk about this, aggro feels like a horse. Aggro feels unreliable moving it. Like, you might actually drive aggro off a cliff, even though the game won't let you. A lot of people lament this game's controls for various reasons, but one of the things that they say to critique this game is aggro's movements aren't as straightforward as something like Epona from Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time.
Right.
You would think that for all of the other designing and programming feats that this game had, it would be able to do a pretty straightforward horse movement. And I've watched, actually, there's a really good video by Nomad Colossus on YouTube about aggro, about just the movements of aggro. And aggro is a photorealistic horse down to the way she sits on like angled cliffs and stuff. It looks and moves exactly like a horse should.
Wow.
I don't think it's a mistake that aggro's hard to control.
Like a mistake.
Yeah, I think that the designers thought there's some kind of interpretive mechanic to not being able to control this precisely.
I wonder what that speaks towards the game.
And I don't know if that's a post hoc rationalization that I'm making and just trying to cover up and apologize for this game's faults, because it does have some faults, like camera and so forth. But I wasn't personally bothered, other than the learning curve of getting to know how to use aggro. It never got in the way of actual narrative development. I mean, one thing to think about is that the gameplay, it is integral to the experience of controlling aggro, because instead of pulling the reins, the player has to wrestle with control over a horse, and that's why it feels like an autonomous being.
Right. I know that the controls, you pull back on the left joystick, and it reins aggro in, which, that was nice.
One of the cool things that I took away from this game is the death of aggro is what inspired Fumito Ueda's following game, The Last Guardian. Trico, the mythical creature that takes up the relationship of that game, The Last Guardian, was inspired because so many people reported back to Fumito Ueda and said, I was moved by this horse. And he just thought, what? That was not remotely within my focus at the time when I was designing it. It was just part of what I was willing to leave in the game. And I love that he has shifted in that direction, because otherwise there's kind of a tide of criticism against what Aggro is doing in this story. By the end of Shadow of the Colossus, there's also a developed sense of control, a kind of mediated expectation of how Aggro will behave in response to Wander's commands. Aggro allows Wander to get close to her, as demonstrated through small and gentle gestures like letting the player pet her while sitting on her back. Another delicate game design shows up in these contingent and optional interactions with Aggro. That is, if Wander ever elects to shoot Aggro with his arrow, then she'll run away or recoil, and for a significant period of time after that assault, Aggro will instinctively flee whenever Wander pulls his bow out, even if he doesn't knock an arrow.
Wow.
So, not every player's going to notice this, and likewise, not every reader of a book will piece together literary consequences from fragmentary and hidden details of a novel. They're not going to see how the motifs function, but some little tiny detail like that is just a microcosm of the larger cosmos that Shadow of the Colossus offers.
Yeah, those are very nice details in the game. That reminds me very much of Divinity Original Sin 2. Where they hide details throughout the world and you have to find them. They're almost hidden like Easter eggs. That seems to be very much hidden in the game. You wouldn't think of shooting your own horse, but if you do it, it has a consequence, and that consequence is temporarily lasting.
So Malice is a Colossus that exemplifies the most human-like qualities of the story's 16 Colossi. Unlike many of the previous encounters with Colossi, Wander's battle with Malice begins with an elaborate series of dodging and sneaking past explosive projectiles, and the player becomes viscerally aware of their vulnerability in the face of a Colossus that, compared to the 15 previous Colossi, is by far the largest structure of the game, and there's some really interesting side-by-side size comparisons of Malice in proportion to the rest of the Colossi. He dwarfs them. Each explosive sent at Wander by Malice shakes the arena, the camera, and at times, I would say, the will of the player. There's an aggression exhibited by Malice. It's this kind of phonetic connotation of malice, maliciousness, which is not present elsewhere in the Colossi. And by the maze's end, and Wander eventually begins climbing Malice, here the human qualities become increasingly apparent.
So Malice looks like a totem built into the ground. He's immovable. He has a torso, and again we have this theme of this motif of horns going on throughout all of the Colossi. Malice has extremely long arms that reach almost all the way down to the base of his almost down to the base of his column where his torso sits. And Malice's base is it's structured like a thick building or a steepled synagogue all the way up to right when you get to the beginning of his torso, and then from his torso it becomes a human form, and this human form is wearing again this almost destroyed civilization armor on top of this fur-like moss structure of a body. And Malice's hands are immense. They're very large for his body as well. There's glyphs on top of all of his skin and all of his armor. He is by far the most intimidating looking. He's towering. He's engaging to look at, but also he is specifically made to be unapproachable. He can assail you, turn around, and see you in all directions. He is almost like a watchman for the Colossi.
Yeah, he's like a sentinel, and his eyes, what's really interesting to me and what struck me playing the game is Shadow of the Colossus doesn't really have nighttime. It's just an always day, kind of foggy, atmospheric vibe. And in this scene, there's a dark series of storm clouds that come in. There's a black sky, and Malice, this kind of sentinel structure, his eyes just burn through against that dark sky. And it reminds me of kind of the Eye of Sauron in a way. Just menacing and all pervading. As Wander scales Malice, he eventually finds refuge on Malice's left arm, and this is towards where you can really start doing damage to Malice. And for the first time in the story, like a Colossus turns its gaze on Wander. It raises his wrist and looks at Wander right before you start going to attack him. And the initial fiery, aggressive attitude that was displayed in Malice's eyes, while they were fixed on Wander, as he was approaching below, they transitioned to an almost curious and inspecting attitude. Wander has somehow bested Malice's immense stature and violent behavior against all the odds. But Malice's pause to examine Wander in this instance, it proves that this pause wasn't, as some critics have mentioned, a technological limitation? Certainly not. We've talked about how impressive this game is. Rather, and going back to Dan Olson, he says that Shadow of the Colossus is already filled with so many impressive moments of transition that this pause where Wander stands and is examined by the being he will soon kill is a conscious decision. And I think he's right. The player has two decisions here. Abandon the game, put down the controller, and turn off their PS4 or whatever. And the other option is proceed to kill a being that has just demonstrated some capacity for moral reciprocity. And either the player can ignore this moral tension between Wander's motivations, means, and actions, or the player can be affected by the otherwise vicious display of callously utilitarian behavior on Wander's selfish actions.
Yeah. There's an immediate sentience about Malice. Malice looks at you as a person. Malice doesn't feel at all like a creature or a warrior. Malice looks like a person who is fighting to survive. It's almost as if with the Colossi, there's this peacefulness, and then as you start going through and murdering more, they become more and more aggressive until you get to Malice, who is defending the final piece of Dorman.
So as the game concludes, Wander finds himself back in the temple for the final time, unconscious. And here he's greeted, unfortunately, by some of the elders from the village that he kind of escaped from and entered the Forbidden Land with he stole the sword, presumably, with Agro, and he stole Mono's dead body and all of that. And they had warned him not to enter these lands, and they've been tracking him, and finally they confront Wander for having kind of broken the code and having sinned, so to speak. And all of a sudden, Dorman coagulates inside of him and emerges in this colossal form. It looks like a shadow version of a Colossus emerges from Wander's body, corrupt all 16 parts of that soul that he's been collecting from these dead Colossi, now manifest themselves, and the player finds themselves in control of a Colossus in this temple. And what's interesting to me, like the introduction to this game where we first meet Dorman, the game allows the player to move the camera around during those scenes, which is just unheard of for that time period. And it also affords a lot of trust that the player is not just going to mess around, that the character or the player is going to take it seriously. At the end of this game, a very similar amount of trust is given where instead of creating a nice cinematic cutscene, the player now has to figure out in real time how to use a Colossus. And the controls are not very straightforward, and they're not consistent, and they're slow. You realize how easy you've had it as Wander's short little kid body scaling these big lumbering beasts. You become empathetic when you're within one. And when you go as Dorman the demon, you go to slam your fist down and crush some of these elders who are firing arrows at you and swinging their swords. you can't catch up with them. And they start to flee and they run and they far outstrip your pace because you can only drag 1 foot at a time. It takes a lot of energy to move a Colossus around. And Emon, the village elder, has taken the sword back from Wander at this point. And he, as the rest of the villagers escape, he kind of casts a spell back in this temple to seal Dorman once again. And we get the sense that it's not sealed in the sense of 16 colossi separating into these parts across the land with these idols. That's been done. That's been destroyed. That's failed. This new spell, he drops the Sword of Light into this pool that then creates a vortex that sucks everything in the temple towards it. It sucks the Dorman being out of Wander. It sucks Wander's own body towards this pool. And the player is given another moment of agency where the player can struggle against this tension, this pull towards that pool of light. And no matter what the player does, they're going to eventually be sucked in. And that inevitability, that it gives you a little bit of leeway to feel like you can struggle, but in reality, it's determined.
That maps directly onto how the game plays as well. That you can struggle on killing the Colossi, but you're going to do it anyways because it's already determined. This game is, it deals with black and white, and the game itself portrays the gameplay and the narrative as also black and white. The theme then becomes the plot. Black and white is the plot. Yes and no, action or no action.
And so, as Wander's finally sucked into this pool, he outstretches his hand, and the camera is framed in such a way where you can see Mono still laying unconscious on the altar down the hallway of the temple. And he's sucked away, and the light seals, and there's nothing in this pool except for a crying baby.
It has horns and is slightly gray.
And that baby, it starts crying, and Mono wakes up. And we learn, by virtue of just the end scene where the credits start to roll, that Dorman has kept his promise. The consequences that Dorman kind of foreshadowed at the very beginning of the game, where he made his bargain with Wander, he said there will be a great toll that could cost your life, and he said, I don't care. This is more important than that. Well, he paid that price, but Dorman kept his promise on the other end too. So Mono is resurrected, and she encounters this baby, which I don't know if we can safely say that it's Wander or not, but it seems to be giving him another chance, but now with kind of the mark of the beast, horns. And as far as the plot goes, the credits roll and Mono cradles this baby, and then Agro comes limping into the temple, and after seeing Agro die, falling off a bridge into the river, you just are weeping with joy almost of just, oh my God, that's a wonderful little silver lining to this tragic narrative. And the three of them go outside of the temple and up the stairs into this kind of Eden paradisical garden where there's little creatures running around. It's the only sign of life other than the Colossi, Wander, Agro, and the lizards in the entire game. And you see like a little deer. And it's just this moment of hope, and there's a tree bearing fruit, and just some magnificent, uplifting hope. So, as that scene happens, though, there's a simultaneous kind of, in the background, anxiety, because when Emon and the rest of the village elders leave, they go fleeing on that bridge that you came in at the beginning of the game, that massive aqueduct-looking bridge, and that bridge collapses behind them, so there's no way back, presumably, to the land where Wander came from, where Mono came from. They're now trapped they might be trapped in paradise, but they're trapped.
The world that Shadow of Colossus happens in looks cruel. It's large, open, and punishing. It forces the player and also Wander to move across massive landscapes that are primarily empty, void of a lot of the typical smatterings that video games typically put in there. So waving grass, wildlife, the typical things you see in open world games that are present nowadays. So like Witcher 3 is an example, or Fallout 3, Fallout 4. Those are examples that Shadow of Colossus is very aware of not having on the screen. So with the cruelty that's there, how did Fumito Ueda make that so apparent? Well, Blake and I have talked about other games using design by subtraction as a feature to pronounce a theme or quality that the designers or the director wants to see in the game. And I think Ueda did the design by subtraction purposely to pronounce the cruelty. So you have, as I said previously, you have the example of wide open terrain for Wander to move across. You have the punishing stone of the temple. You have the heavy amounts of light and dark. These very, very sharp contrasting features that are there's a lot of raggedness with how much there's a contrast between light and dark, and that's a very big focal point in the game. The oppressive nature of what you're fighting, the Colossi, how the creatures look, not just their size, but how the creatures look, and on top of that, the size and scope of the temple. All of those things lead me to look at the game as a very cruel place to be. Wander's alone, and he's trying to bring someone back to life that he loves very much. And he's forced to go up against impossibility. Cruelty is a major feature in this game, and I think it's pronounced by the design by subtraction. The setting that Wander moves through is vague and it's kind of like an undisclosed land. We have this theory going on that it's maybe sacred and ruled, or at least inhabited by these colossi. However, the surrounding land is almost purposefully empty, as if to stress a point. There's a massive focus. I mean, the sword is an example of massive focus. It is a beacon nearly that Wander holds up. But in some sense, I would say that, the sword might be a beacon, but it's more like a focusing tool, not necessarily a beacon, where it's capturing light or capturing a presence of light that's in front of it and glinting the light back at whatever was shining at it in the first place. That's one feature that the sword does very well, and so that mechanic of Wander holding it up kind of detracts from the rest of the landscape. The landscape bleeds away as Wander's doing this, as Wander's holding his sword up, capturing the light from where the colossi is. And that the colossi seems to be shooting light at the sword, and it's reflecting off the sword, I think is saying another thing. It's pronouncing that the colossi are there. It's making them very apparent, almost like a spotlight shining onto them. Not on the landscape, but where to go to find the colossi. That's the entire focus of the game. The landscape is always in the background. It's something that remains kind of like the underlying syntax, the thing that helps give the game a place to be, but it's not the focus. If you were to remove it, it would be wandering through still an unknown place, but you would still have the colossi as an anchor, making the game aware of itself. And I think that's something that the Shadow of Colossus does very well, is that it's aware of itself. It's aware of what it's showing you. It's aware of what it's trying to get the player to focus on. And I think that's a lot of what Designed by Subtraction attempts to do. It attempts to get a major theme pronounced in a game through sometimes unsuspecting game mechanics. So like the sword and the empty-styled landscape, the size and scope of the colossi, the stark contrast, the cruel contrasts between dark and light, and the oppressive size of the temple that Wander starts in.
One of the hallmarks of a story's success is the kind of serial reincarnation as it appears time and again in its narrative pattern throughout culture. And you see this play out in archetypal thinking with literature and elsewhere. Shadow of the Colossus adheres to this mold, and it was released originally in 2005, then came out in America in 2006, and then it had a HD kind of bundle re-release, the Eco and Shadow of the Colossus collection in 2011. So now, as we're releasing this episode in 2018, we're keenly aware that there's about to be another from the ground up re-release by Bluepoint Studios. And Bluepoint is a fascinating company that I think we should put our faith in. We're very excited for this kind of PlayStation 4 incarnation of Shadow of the Colossus, which is why we are talking about this so early on in our series of Ludonarrative discussions. Bluepoint has had their hands in Uncharted and Gravity Rush and Flower and Titanfall and Metal Gear Solid and seemingly every relevant poster child of contemporary video gaming. So we have, at least I have, a lot of faith in the value of this upcoming re-release, and we'll be talking about it a lot over at Epilogue Gaming. But beyond that, beyond the economic kind of imperative to have this discussion, I think one of the questions is, do games hold up over time? And you can talk about that in terms of graphical design mechanics, you can talk about that in terms of processing speed, so on and so forth. But I think one of the questions that we should walk away with is this game worth its salt across time as technology kind of improves and the impressiveness of the achievements within Shadow of the Colossus denigrate? And so what do you think, Preston?
Does this game hold up to a 2018 audience? I think it's always good to revisit old things. Old things teach you stuff. They give you groundwork. And I think that's the important part.
In this conversation, we deliberately didn't talk about the relationship between Shadow of the Colossus and the other two games of Fumito Ueda, Eco and The Last Guardian. I mean, there were moments where we hinted at it, but there is a clear relationship there. I want to table all of those connections, as interesting as they are, as much lore as there is, because, for instance, Shadow of the Colossus with the horned baby at the end, that is a direct precursor, and this has been confirmed in interviews. It's a prequel to Eco, the game that was actually released 4 years before Shadow. And that's kind of a reverse Star Wars chronology sort of moment. But the lore that connects each one of the games, it's subtle and it's implied, but it's clearly there. I would like to explore all of that, but I'm going to be releasing a series of short essays on epiloguegaming.com about these. So I would say, for those interested in continuing those sort of connections and furthering that discussion, you could contact us at Twitter, Ludonarrative FM, and I'm happy to entertain questions over there. But for now, I think that we've done a pretty good job of putting a bow on Shadow of the Colossus.
Yeah, I agree with that.
At the end of each episode, we want to entertain a Patreon question from our supporters over at patreon.com/epiloguegaming. And this week's question comes from a listener who asks, how did you two become involved with Epilogue Gaming?
I became involved with Epilogue Gaming because one day Blake and we were doing our Need for Nuance podcast, and we started talking about how video games are doing something similar and also something a little bit different than literature. And we were both irritated by how video games were perceived both in everyday life and especially in academics. And so we decided to start throwing this idea out at different conferences. And so that led to us meeting a guy named Ben, who Blake already knew, and developing a relationship with him. Ben got to see how vividly video games were viewed in academia, where Blake and I would speak, and Ben would speak, in front of empty chairs when we wanted to give presentations to full houses of people on the subject of video games as literature. And so for me, I got involved through annoyance and through want to provide video games an outlet in academia that I think it very much requires.
Okay. It is kind of a long story with our history of conferences and such. I thought I was going to be working on a PhD here in the coming fall of 2018. I've since changed my mind about that, but the idea was to bulk up my academic resume and go do these research conferences. And with this new idea that I was writing about, inspired by The Last Guardian and Shadow of the Colossus, Eco, and other games, I decided why not use these opportunities to kind of do both and apply my literature background to these video game conversations. And so I knew Ben already, and when we got accepted in these conferences, I had submitted as a panel, and it was just Preston and myself. And I thought, wouldn't it be a little bit stronger if we had another voice? And when I mentioned this idea to Ben, he took it down a totally different route than I was taking it, because the kind of video games Ben likes to play, which he usually plays on his Twitch at BenGerman10, he plays a lot of these games that are longer form, a little more in depth, like Dark Souls and Bloodborne, some of the other games like Zelda games that he's played on his stream. But we had a strong overlap as well, and so it just so happened that he was launching Epilogue Gaming, and he was kind enough to extend us the invitation. And so here we are after just weeks and months of thinking about these things and planning. So a huge shout out and thank you to Ben and the rest of you all for supporting and making this happen.
If you'd like your questions answered on the next time's podcast, become a monthly patron for as little as $1 per month over at patreon.com/Epilogue Gaming. Your support is what has made this podcast possible. And in the meantime, head over to epiloguegaming.com for more explorations of video games as a medium for art, literature, and a storytelling medium. Music for this episode has been provided by Kawatane, recorded by Preston Johnston and edited by Blake Guthrie, produced by Ben Volmer and Epilogue Gaming. We'll see you next month. Thank you for listening to the Ludonarrative Podcast.